that's taking one for the team. That's old school. Yeah, when I was in Boy Scouts, we had garters, and back in the day, and so the thing, they were such a sort of a nuisance to put on. The way you'd kind of bug your friends is you'd sneak up behind them and pull the little garter socks down, and that was. Yeah. The old Boy Scout uniform had a little tall socks with the little tabs on the side, and that was attached to garters that were underneath your socks. So.
Well, these were above the socks.
Ooh, now that's a different look. But fish. Shall we go fishing? Welcome to the Nature Journal Club workshop. How many folks, it's your first time with us? So we've got, welcome. So every month at this location, we've got a new free nature journaling workshop, different topic each time. And we also have field trips where we go out to other places in the San Francisco Bay Area. This month, we're going to be going to the gardens at Heather Farms over in Walnut Creek. Next month, after our workshop, our second workshop on drawing fish, we're going to be going to the California Academy of Sciences and drawing from their aquarium there. So it's a chance to sketch and draw, usually on subjects that relate to what we're doing, although we're not really going to a fishy place this month. The idea is that if you just take a class on how to draw, you might learn some tricks, but it doesn't really become your routine and habit to be drawing on a regular basis. If you want to make drawing something that your brain does, you just have to get yourself to be doing it on a regular basis. So the secret to that is to find some way of getting drawing in your routine every month. And the more often you do it, the better. So if you're hanging out with the Nature Journal Club, you're getting out there and journaling at least twice a month here in our workshop, and then on our field trip. And I also am going to be giving you homework, because this really is a thing that if you get your brain to do it on a regular basis, you change the structure of your brain so that you are then able to draw what you see. And today what I want to do is for us to work with fish. And in that I'll be showing you a few kind of basic, also kind of fundamental ideas in drawing whatever it is that you want to draw. But we'll be focusing on fish. The general ideas are, on one level, you want to have an understanding of the anatomy of your subject, how it's put together, what you should be looking for, what you expect to see. On the other hand, you want to have a few general drawing tools that allow you to take a shape that you see and transfer that to the paper. So being able to transfer shapes and understanding the structure and anatomy, putting those two things together, you've got a really strong framework to be able to, in a very flexible way, draw and sketch what you see. In today's class, we're going to be looking at how to draw a side view portrait of a fish. This is the classic scientific illustration approach to drawing fish, the sort of thing you see in a field guide with little lines pointing to all the identification characteristics. In order to do that, we're going to get an understanding of all the weird structures on the fish, where to look for variation, what to expect with the fins, where they go, and how they attach, and what variation you can expect to see in that. We are also going to take a little bit of a look at drawing the scales on a fish and how those overlap, and how to simplify scales to make it be something that you can more easily do, so you can draw your fish to scale. So at the start, though, I want to warn everybody, we're going to do a deep dive into fish anatomy. And so here we go. So this is my volunteer fish here. This is what I call Morpha Fish. And this fish, I'm going to be changing different parts on it, one sort of characteristic at a time, so you can see some of the variation that you'd expect to see in looking at fish. Fish are absolutely incredible, wonderfully diverse group. Like birds, which have all these great loud patterns and colors, fish are the same way. And so here's a little sketch. We'll be doing a walk-through step by step on how to draw this one in just a little bit. But they have just loud, outrageous patterns, incredible shapes. So they're really, really fun to look at. And as long as you don't get lost in the scales, we'll be looking at kind of ways of just suggesting that. That makes it much more doable. So here's our little buddy fish. This one is in the classic position for a scientific illustration. The way that sort of scientific illustration was formally done is there would be an illustrator on a ship. It would be a scientific expedition, and they'd go out to some reef somewhere. People would go down and dive or put nets out, catch fish. You then give it to the illustrator, who would on the spot make a drawing and painting of that fish with all the colors that you see. Once the fish dies, its colors begin to dramatically change. And so before those colors are gone, they would draw and paint color in that fish. Then you pass it over to the person who's going to drop it into the jar to pickle it, and you bring it back to the science museum. In doing those drawings, they would take all the fins and spread them out so that you could see all the detail of the fins. It's sort of like with butterflies, where they take the butterfly's wings and they stretch them out to this sort of Vitruvian Man position, where you get to see all the details of the fish, of the butterfly, and the fish are the same way. Fish usually aren't in this sort of, this is like a fish that put its fin in a light socket with all of its fins sticking straight out. And you can see all the fins when it's doing this, and sometimes if they're displaying to another fish, they like walk up to another fish and they kind of like go, oh, all right? But as they're sort of swimming around, kind of getting their regular fish thing on, they're more in a position like this, with those fins sort of down. And sometimes you'll see one kind of pop up more as they're maneuvering around, or again, if they are displaying, sometimes they'll like turn full on sideways to another fish and go, whoop. But this is sort of more typical about what you see. But this is kind of the classic scientific illustration. And we'll be looking at how you approach this, how you understand all these little different bits and pieces. And where to look on a fish to find characteristics that are going to be really diagnostic for an individual species. I'm going to start by looking at the body of the fish and kind of morphing that around. Then we're going to take a close look at its head, and then fin by fin we'll be adding fins to our fish until it's finished. And here's where we're going to start. This is my generic fish, and but this one can't swim very well yet. On its, some fish have a long body. On other fish, you will see a more short, compact body. And that's the initial thing which we really want to pay attention to. So you're going to be building your fish drawing over a model that'll either be long, narrow, and skinny, or broad. When you look at the fish from the front, some fish are more rounded in profile or in front view. Others are really laterally compressed, like you slam them in a book. And but the first thing you do want to pay attention to is that overall body shape. You'll see down the side of the fish what looks like a little seam, a little indentation. Sometimes this is differently colored than the rest of the fish. This ends up being a really important morphological feature. It's called the lateral line. And this is loaded with little sensors that can either detecting water pressure or sometimes even electric fields in the area. This little lateral line, its shape is going to be different on different species. Some it's going straight. This one has a nice curve to it. So that's a good body feature that you're going to be looking at. And then the whole thing then will be covered with scales, and we do scales at the end. On its head, there are a few features that you can add in that make your fish drawing look much more fishy. And we're going to target just a few of those. We're going to take a look at the shape of fish mouths and also this gill plate on the side of the head. Things to expect to see in those areas and how to put them together. This is a scientific illustration of the skull of a fish. You see there's a bunch of little plates in here. The good news is you don't have to know all this stuff. We're just going to isolate out of this a couple of key features. Feature number one is this bone right here on the edge of the mouth. All right? So this is the maxillary bone, and I'm going to go through a couple of fish skulls here. Here's another fish. Here's its maxillary bone, a smaller one on this one. Here is a trout. Here's its maxillary bone. And so this maxillary bone when the fish closes its mouth, this is sort of sitting on the upper lip. As the fish opens its mouth, this swings down. So the rest of the jaw is going inside of this. Let's go back to this one here. This swings down. This ends up, this is kind of what gives the fish that sort of fish expression. All right? So the max, if this is my simplified fish head here, I'm going to have my maxillary bone that is going to come down, and my fish lower jaw will come down from behind that. Then the other thing I want to point out is that there's a big set of 4 bones that makes a large plate over the fish's gills. This together is the gill plate or the operculum. And so there are 4 opercular bones. And one of those has this very distinctive boomerang shape right here. That's the premaxillary. And as we go through a couple of, oh good, it's not a permanent marker. As we go through, here's that boomerang shape again, right there. Sort of, it is my dyslexic L. Here it is again. So most of the bones here in the operculum are fairly smooth together, but this pre-opercular bone right here actually makes a little ridge on the side of the face. So going back here, if I have my big gill plate here, I'm going to look for this little L-shape seam across that. That helps you kind of break up what otherwise would be a large space of kind of featureless territory. But that's the back edge of the boomerang here. And sometimes on that, there are even there's little ornamentation, spikes or those sorts of things that you'll see sticking out on the side of that. And then the back edge of the operculum, it would be, well, I didn't trace that very well, but would be back there. So that's the back edge of my operculum. The last little bit of fish skull detail is that this gill plate covers up the gills on the inside, the breathing apparatus of the fish. And those gills are attached to this set of bones underneath the bottom edge of the operculum. Right? So these are the brachiostygial bones. And these things attach to the gills. So I'll go back to that other drawing so I have more room in here. You don't see the brachiostygials in here. But expect to see a series of gill-like ridges here underneath that operculum plate, sticking out underneath the head of the fish. And if this is something that you're looking for, you're going to see it on a lot of fish, and it really kind of helps your fish drawing. Sticking out from underneath that gill plate.
Okay.
So the gill plate is here, and then these brachiostygial arches are coming down underneath that. And so I'm going to see those tucking up, boom, 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 and then my gill plate. My eye is going to go somewhere in here, and I want to pay attention to a couple of things in placing my eye. One is, where in here is that eye? I want to look at this distance and this distance back here. What is the distance to the top? Right. That helps me place my eye in there. And then I also want to be aware of the relationship between the eye and the bottom of this maxillary bone. On some fish, they have a tiny little mouth here. And the back edge of this is before even you get to the eye. On others, you're going to have this thing coming back past the back edge of the eye. So that's another sort of useful landmark in making. Can you guys see all right from over here? Right? If you, yeah, so you see this little detail right over here?
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. It may not be efficient for us to sit this way. If you'd like to, you can move over this way. So those are a few skull characteristics that are useful for us to have in our repertoire. And you'll find that you get those, and it is going to improve your fish drawing dramatically. Your fish will start to kind of have that fish face. All right. The eyes, a couple of interesting things to point out on those. We're used to really round pupils. In humans, a pupil that is not round is a sign of possible brain injury. So one of the things that people are looking at is checking pupillary response, but also the shape of your pupils when they're looking into your eyes. Are you okay? Are you okay? So with fish, you're going to see these asymmetrical pupils all the time, and it doesn't mean the fish has a brain injury. So often there's a pointed end, very often towards the front of the fish, so we can look for that little sort of asymmetry in it. And the iris itself often has a very brightly colored ring around the outside edge of the pupil. So if I'm doing this in watercolor, sometimes I'll just handle that by putting a layer of dark color over this, let that dry, draw in an even darker pupil, and then just take a little white colored pencil or another colored pencil and pick up that little ring around there, and that pops the eye very nicely. From the side, so this is a side view of the eye of a fish. So the fish's head is here, and we were looking kind of sort of front on this. And you see that there is a cone of tissue that comes out, and the eye is sitting into that. Some fish, it's much more flush, but this is, you'll see on lots of fish, expect this little cone come out a little bit more on the top than on the bottom. And that fits that eye into the side of the fish. So sometimes when you're seeing the fish from the side, you'll see this little tube sticking out. The little eye is then sitting on the end of that. If you're looking at photographs online of either deep sea fish or things like rockfish, which have been brought up from below, and there's a picture of this person saying, "Look, I caught a rockfish," what you'll see are these like big buggy eyes like this. Right? And so if we include that in our drawing, we're actually picking up there, not on something that, so then you sort of draw the rest of the natural habitat in behind it, and the fish is doing this. So what's gone on is that this fish down below, when it was underneath the water, it had just sort of normal fish eyes and was kind of hanging out, being a good little fish. And then it gets caught in a net and quickly brought up to the surface. When a diver goes up too quickly, they get the bends, or a decompression sickness. What happens is the gas inside there that is dissolved in their blood starts to expand. In this case, the gas that is inside the fish's swim bladder, this little buoyancy regulation sac inside its body, starts to expand dramatically. And it gets bigger and bigger inside the body, sometimes pushing out the mouth of the fish or causing the eyes to bug out. When I was a little kid, I had these photo books of deep sea fish, and there are these really cool things called viper fish. Here's my little drawing of a viper fish, and they have these big nasty jaws, and they're really, really cool. The books that I would have of these pictures of the viper fish always then had this big sack like that. That is because they caught this thing deep, pulled it up to the surface, and its swim bladder went. But you look at them under the water, they don't have this giant swim bladder. So kind of a fun little fact. So drawings of fish with barato trauma from being brought up a little bit too quickly. So buggy eyes, but not too buggy. Right. So when we look at this, we've talked a little bit about this big upper lip, a little bit about here. Here is our L-shaped pre-opercular bone. That's the back edge of it. And a little bit of those brachiostegial grooves underneath the throat here. That just makes the fish look a little bit more fishy. Now what I'm going to do is start to add all sorts of fins and things onto this fish. And having an idea of the range of variation in the different parts of this fish is very helpful. And very often you can look at a fish and sort of see how it's modified, how it is set up to be able to do different sorts of things. You can take different parts of the fish, like the mouth, like how the fins are set up. By changing those, you really change the function of the fish really dramatically. So, here's sort of maybe a normal sort of fishy mouth. You can also take this, pull it out here. Here is another way that this whole apparatus could be. Little tiny mouth on the end of a big stalk. But you look there, there's that little maxillary, right? Or fish that swim around and kind of look up towards the surface for things to come up and get, have these upward-facing mouths. Right? And fish that are kind of going around on the bottom, vacuum cleanering things up, have these downward-facing mouths. So very often the orientation of the mouth says something about how this fish is operating. So those are good things to look for. It's also useful to look for, does this fish have an overbite or an underbite? Right? So that gives you sort of a flavor of variation in fish mouths. Another thing we're going to see variation with on the opposite end is what goes on with the tail. And this is maybe sort of one of the simpler tail arrangements. This sort of eel-style tail, just a ribbon of tissue sticking out the back of our little fish here. If you're drawing a fish with an arrangement like this, a couple of things to really places to pay a lot of attention. One is that sometimes there will be part of this this fin that goes around the back that will be larger, taller, in some places shorter. So is it consistent height all the way around? Also pay attention to, people will tend to stop and start them at the same place. They're often not going to do that. And if you are going to see variation in it, very often right here at the tail tip, you'll see something interesting. Maybe it kind of does this sort of eel-style thing. Another thing you'll often see is that this fin actually stops right there, and then there's a little tiny fishy tail that will come out like that. So those are other good things to look for in these ribbon-like tails. You often see this arrangement not on a big boxy fish like this, but on a long, narrow, snake-like fish. If we have more of a classic fish tail, there are a number of variations that you should expect to see with that as well. So here I have a round tail shape, and this is great if my fish wants to make sudden acceleration. Got a lot of surface to area, I go and I'm zipping over to there. But as it's flapping back and forth, especially in this area of the tail, there's a lot of drag that gets created, and that slows down the fish. You're going to get tired if you're swimming creating a lot of drag. So this is good for a sudden burst of acceleration. But if you're going to be sustaining this swimming, that's not going to work very well. So a fish that might be kind of hanging out in the rocks or the reeds and is then going to zip over to here, but isn't going to be making any long distance swims in the water, might have a tail arrangement like this or like this. Looking at the back, the shape of the back margin of the tail is a really good place for us as fish illustrators to key in on. This again gives you a lot of room for drag. By eliminating part of that, snip it off. This is a better arrangement. This is your sort of standard flat tail. But still, even in this area here, I'm getting some drag. So some fish have a little bit of a notch, or even in more open water swimming, so, I might have something like this.
What do you mean by drag?
So drag is turbulence that gets created. So if let's use the airplane wing example. If air is flowing smoothly over and under the wing, this is really efficient for creating lift and helping the plane stay up. As this wing starts to tilt at other angles, what happens is air starts to create eddies and turbulence back here. And that you lose lift or you lose your thrust, the more drag you are getting. So to avoid this, the part of the wing that gets that, fish will do that. Birds, interestingly, do this little thing where they have a little flap that flips up on their wing that helps smooth the airflow, the alula, but that's for our bird drawing class. So it's turbulence that is created back there by the tail. And that is making the fish less efficient as it's swimming along. So this might be more of an open water arrangement, or something that is a fish that is going to do a lot of sort of speedier swimming. The really extreme case of this is the tuna. And if I stick a tuna tail on my little fish here, I get this huge moon-shaped tail, a little stabilizer in the middle of it. And so this, no drag, this isn't very maneuverable, but this is going to allow me just to get a ton of speed. I keep that little propeller going in the back, and I just get more and more and more and more speed. This is a very, very fast fish. But I'm not going to be able to do that same kind of maneuvering and kind of fast out of the gate. Perhaps that fish with a larger tail surface might have a better kind of initial zip. Tuna also have these little finlets along the side of the tail there. Kind of a neat feature. I don't know the question is that for drag? I don't know the function of those. If anybody's looking at this video on YouTube, let us know if you know what is the function of those. It'd be interesting to see how hydrodynamically those affect water flow around the fish. Everything in the tuna seems to be for this ultimate efficiency in motion. So since those are on a tuna, I suspect that they do something cool. And I bet if you put those on airplanes, it would go even faster. This arrangement, if we take the bottom part and shrink it down a little bit, this is what we expect to see with a shark. Whereas this being really symmetrical, with every tail stroke, it pushes your fish forward. With this system, you get more push from the top than you do from the bottom. And so if you're not paying attention and the top is pushing more, you're going to start heading your fish down or your shark down. So you'll see on fish and sharks that have this larger tail portion in the front, right up here, you're going to have a set of fins that are out doing this to provide something to fight against this pushing down. So this is pushing down this way, these are flat out this way, and then that gets transferred into motion in this direction. So it's kind of a neat little fish, sharky system here, which gets us starting to add front fins. All right. So these fins right here, right below the face here, those are called the pectoral fins. They're homologous to my forelimbs. So out here I've got my pectoral fins, and I have one on each side, just like little arms. So in a shark, they're down low, being this brace. In a lot of the other fish that have more of a symmetrical tail, it's going to move up here on the side of the fish. And so that's the same thing. That's the pectoral fin, just moved up onto the side. Very often what I'll do if I'm drawing one of these fins, I'll first draw in the perculum here, and then look at where is this little fin relative to that. Short distance, so right from behind here. That gives us our tail fins, also called a caudal fin, and our pectoral fins. So you can remember that the pectoral fins are the ones that are in front because your front arms are up by your pectoral muscles. So these are my pectoral muscles. These are my pectoral fins. That's the other name for the tail. The caudal fin is the other name for the tail. Ooh, you're asking the dyslexic how to spell. Is anybody in the room now? C-A-U-D-A-L. C-A-U-D-A-L? That sounds good to me. I'm now going to start to add other fins. What is the name of that big fin that's on the top of the shark? Dorsal fin. All right, so the fins that are on the top of the fish are our dorsal fins. So here are my dorsal fins. And this is a typical way that dorsal fins are going to be set up. with two different segments. One part in the front that has more widely spaced big spines, stiff, sharp spines. And then a back part with more numerous, more flexible spines. So on a lot of fins, fish fins, you'll see these two sections, a few sharp spines, and then a little section in the back with more soft section. A more extreme version of this here's what's happening on the tuna. All right? So here is that first part of the dorsal fin, and here's that second part. Sometimes a very small connection between them there. If I get all the way to something like a bass, I might have an arrangement like this. These are still called dorsal fins. I can have one dorsal fin with different sections. I can have the first and second dorsal fin. And in some fish, there's even a first, second, and third dorsal fin. So all the ones on the top here, those are dorsal fins. Here is the shark version of it, first and second dorsal fin. All right. Or those can be all fused together in one more homogeneous little fin, kind of what we're used to seeing on our little goldfish or a trout. So that's the dorsal fin. One other fin that sometimes shows up on a few groups of fish is right back here before you get to the tail. There's a very sort of strange, fleshy, thick little fin, a tiny little thing that doesn't seem to, help you sort of, change direction or stabilize in the water. It's called the adipose fin. It's this tiny little fleshy fin. You'll see this on trout, on salmon. You'll see this on catfish. So just a few groups have this, but so a couple, this little adipose fin will be there on the back. In fish hatcheries, if they're releasing trout from a fish hatchery, before they let the fish go, they snip this little fin off. So people can tell, oh, this was a fish that came from a fish hatchery, versus, oh, this was a fish that was born in the wild. So you go to a lake, you're actually able to pick up the fish and look at it. Was this something that they brought in with helicopters from a hatchery? Or was this a fish that was born in this lake? For a long time, people thought that this little adipose fin didn't have any function. But some recent studies, they found out that fish with their adipose fin cut off, as they're swimming upstream, those fish, the one with their adipose fin is kind of going along with its tail doing this, kind of working its way up. The same speed, it's one with the adipose fin coming off its tail is going like, so much greater rate, the sort of frequency of tail beats. So there's something that's going on. Also, it turns out that the adipose fin is just packed with nerves. And so it probably has something to do with the fish's sensory system. And so there's something going on with the adipose fin. Maybe it's like the sixth fish sense. And so there's one that get it snipped off and not very happy about that. But we're just sort of starting to get new appreciation for this otherwise sort of unimpressive little nub that sticks out the back. Those are the fins on the top. Now we'll add fins on the bottom. Yep, so ventral fin is the name, it's also called the anal fin is for one at the back. So we've got the dorsal fin and the ventral fin. Before we get to the ventral fin, I'm going to do the one that is the paired set. We have the ones that are homologous to the hands or the arms. There's also another set of paired fins on the underside of the fins of the fish that is homologous with our legs. So we've got our little leg fins and our arm fins. So here are little leg fins. They are called these are my pectoral fins. These are my pelvic fins. So coming from my fish pelvis. All right. So here are my pelvic fins. What? So pectorals up here. Pectorals are the front ones. And then lower down, I get my pelvic fins. Another set of paired fins. So these are paired. This is single. This is single. These are paired on either side of the body. The pectoral fins are paired, and the pelvic fins are paired. So here's one, here's two. On most fish, you're going to see these, if you drop a line down from where the pectoral fins come in, further back, you're going to get your pelvic fins. On a few fish that have the pectoral fins up high, like the cod, its pelvic fins actually insert in front of the pectoral fins. So here is so some fish, you actually are moving those forward. Here's a picture of a cod. Take a moment to look at it. Can you see the pectoral fins and the pelvic fins? What's this? All right. So this one, its pelvic fins are coming out in front. I mean, towards the head of this little critter. If I drop a line down from this, so it's kind of an odd arrangement. Usually you see these further down the fish. Other kind of cool thing about this cod here, let's just take a look for a minute, that one in the background. Look at that dorsal fin. Boom, boom, boom. All right? So the first, the second, and the third dorsal fin. Somehow, ichthyologists, no other scientists have been able to do this, but ichthyologists showed restraint. And what they said is, look, there's the dorsal fin on the back, and we're going to call this one the first dorsal fin, the second dorsal fin, and the third dorsal fin, instead of coming up with completely different terms for all of those. So I want to send a shout out to ichthyologists. So there are my pelvic fins. Thank you. So just a quick review. What's this? Tail, or the caudal fin. Pelvic, pectoral, and you said you've got the dorsal fin, and its companion is the so you said here. This is my dorsal fin. Here, the ventral fin. So single fin at the back here. This one is also called the anal fin. So it's either called the ventral fin or the anal fin. The fish's anus is right here in front of this fin. And it's a single fin, like the dorsal. So I have a lot of variation you can have in the shape of this as well. So on this little fin, I can have, and notice that this one is starting off with some thick spines and then getting into softer ones. Yes, sir? No, the question is, do all fish have 8 fins? No, they don't. In some fish, you know, like that eel-like thing, you just have that one little fin going around. Different fish, these will be lost, or little vestigial things, and so the sometimes, you know, one of the fins can be entirely missing, and you're kind of like, aren't you missing a? Or it can be doing that dorsal fin thing with 1, 2, 3 dorsal fins. You're like, wow, that's a lot of dorsal fins. So not all fish have all these fins. Here is an anal fin or ventral fin version that we see with a tuna. So the tuna, when you look at it, it is this crazy shaped thing. What a spectacular animal. How depressing is it that when we think of tuna, we think of the can, right? And here's this incredible thing. So let's just do a little kind of fin quiz here. Decide. So take a look at those fins, and I'm going to point to it, and then you call it. Ready? Good. Yeah, there's dorsal 2. Let's do this one first. Pelvic. Yeah, anal or ventral. So either one, we can use either one of those names. So this is look at how my ventral fin looks like my second dorsal fin. Really cool. And then all of these wonderful little finlets along the side here. What a glorious, glorious animal. And just think that all over the world, these things used to be extremely abundant. these sort of fisheries are just crashing. We have technology that is so good at pulling fish out of the ocean that we are pulling them out faster than they can go back in. We now have the capacity to do that. And all over the world, fisheries are collapsing. That means there used to be fish here. There aren't fish here anymore. Just another reason just to give these things some respect. The more you look at these, you just kind of go like, yeah, we kind of got an obligation to kind of take care of these. So that not all these things end up in that little tuna tin. What an incredible animal. Look at this weird parasite inside of it. All right, so quick fin quiz. What are those? Good. You got it. All right, so when you're looking at a fish, you're going to try to first sort of make sense of it. And just remember that some of these fins can be flattened down. Some of them can be sticking up. Sometimes I've been drawing a fish, and I go like, oh, it's missing those. And then all of a sudden that fin will go. Yes?
Is the anus always behind or in front of
Oh, the anus is in front of the anal fin. Yeah. Well, I'm always scared of the word always. As far as I know, I don't know of any cases where that's not the case. But with the great diversity of these sort of cool fish in the world, somebody's got to. I mean, the fish are an incredibly diverse group. Maybe there's one that has the anus in a different place relative to the anal fin, but I don't know of one. Friends at home watching this on YouTube, if you do know of one, add it in the notes. So let's do this fish step by step. All right? I'm going to show you how I might go about drawing this, painting this, sort of step by step. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the general posture of this bird and then focus on getting its proportions. The most important thing to do at the start is to get the proportions of this fish. We want to get in here and draw this cool little mouth and draw these little fins. And what will happen is your brain will exaggerate the size of the parts of this fish that are the most interesting to you. That is these cool little sort of face area, the tail, the fins. And what will inevitably happen is that the body mass of your fish, which is kind of the boring part of the fish, that part in the middle between all those neat fins and adaptations on the outside edge, that ends up getting sort of shrunken in our sketches. The same thing happens when we're drawing people. We make the boring parts of a head much smaller. So that's why people will draw people's heads starting here. We make the eyes way too high because this part of the head is boring. Right? We draw the eyes way too big because they're really interesting. So just be aware that we have a tendency to draw the interesting stuff bigger. And at the start, what we're going to be focused on is getting the proportions of this. How can I take this fish and get its proportions down onto the paper? Then we'll look at how we draw the details in. So here's some strategies for those proportions. I'm going to start just with the central axis of this thing's body. And I'm going to look at how wide is it versus how deep that body is. And I'm going to, so just looking at it is on one thing, putting it down on paper is another. I want to put it down on the paper and look back at the fish and say, is this like that? Because I'm going to assume that there's something wrong with my proportions at the start. Assume that you did something a little bit goofy, and you'll be much more likely to catch it. Then, I'm just going to put in kind of a placeholder for the bulk, the mass of this fish's body. And again, I look at this, and I compare it to the fish out there. Is that roughly the right proportions for this fish's body? Then, without drawing any details, a couple of other proportion lines that are very helpful are the head, the end of the mass of the body, and the end of the tail. So how much of this fish is head? In this case, about a third. So I'm going to lightly put in some lines to show me those edges. Then I am going to start to, instead of focus on, once I do this, I've got my basic proportions. I'm now going to start looking at the shape of the edges of the body, the contours, the angles on the edges of this fish's body. The best way to do this is not to look at the fish. That's where all the distracting detail is. Instead, look at the shape of the water next to the fish. So look at what is this shape here. And I put that in, and I will get the shape of my fish. If you are drawing instead the shape when you look at the fish, it's too easy to start drawing the way your brain thinks this fish should look. You don't have an idea in your head of how the water next to a fish should look. So that's what we're going to draw. We're going to draw the part of the fish that our brain doesn't have a preconceived judgment about. And when we do that, I get these things like, oh, wow, this is a much steeper or sort of longer slope than this. This fish's mouth is not right on its center line. And so I can draw in. I don't have to shade those areas. I just want to visualize those shapes here in order to get those lines. That's called using negative shapes. Artists use this all the time to draw whatever it is that they're looking at. So I'm going to look at the non-fish in order to get the fish. I'm going to start to drop in my fins. What I'll often do is put a little tick mark where I see the start of a fin. Here it's pectoral fin, or pelvic fin on the underside of the body. It's going to start here and end here. Whoop. So I'm looking at where along this curve does that start, where along this curve does that end. And then I'm going to do that for the entire fish. But notice how I've made these little lines here as little tick marks, these little vertical tick marks. What I'm trying to show here, and I usually don't actually draw these lines in, I'll go to the next drawing here, see those lines disappeared. I'm saying visualize this point where this comes in as a line that is coming down. Where does this insert relative to where the ones on the bottom are coming in? So I'm not just drawing the fins on the bottom and independently drawing the fins on the top. I'm saying, where does this part of this fin insert relative to what is going on up here? So I'm looking at the top and the bottom of this fish together. So if I want, I could be drawing a light line all the way down like that and looking at there, or just visualizing that. But I want to get the top and the bottom parts lined up. Then, a few lines to kind of block in the head, the back edge of the operculum, or gill plate, where the front and the back of the eye are going to be located. So how big is the eye? How close is that eye to the front? How close is that eye to the back? This one here?
No, it was the line you put in. It's the other vertical. Yes, that one.
Oh, that was back when I was saying roughly its head is going to be this section here. So that was way back here where I was saying, there we go. This much is head, right? Then this is sort of the bulk of its body. And then the end of its tail is here. I'm also putting a little tick in at the back corner of its mouth. Some fish, the mouth will come down past the eye. Some fish partway through the eye. Some fish, the mouth ends before you get to the edge of the eye. So that's going to be a very useful thing to intentionally look for instead of just drawing in a generic fish mouth. Lastly, I have my little pectoral fin up as a triangle on the side of the body. I find it's easier to put in the gill plate or operculum and then put that pectoral fin in behind it. So how does this fit in with that? And now I've got this framework for my fish. So there's a lot of kind of up front working out the geometry of this. And don't fall in love with any of the lines that you put on the paper too soon. If you draw the line really bold and hard, your brain will lock into it and say, that line is right, it's in the right place because I drew it so deliberately. Make this first part of the drawing really kind of tentative and kind of, I'm going to put it over here, yeah, kind of, and that way your brain has the wiggle room to be willing to change the location of this. If I'm putting in this fin and kind of go like, oh no, that's not working down here, instead of just ignoring it and drawing on, kind of backtrack and say like, well, if that's actually coming there, then that's not in the right position either. And then there's this whole cascade of other things that you need to sort of micro-correct. Do that at this stage rather than, but it's super tempting to ignore that and just keep on drawing. And then you get to the end of the drawing and you draw in all your details. Things aren't really fitting and all those proportions are off. It's easy to change the location of the fin when it's just that. The minute you start to draw in the details, you're locked in. Your brain's not going to want to erase and move anything else around. So over this framework, I just start to then draw my fish. And I'm thinking about those, here is sort of the shape of my mouth, the shape of fins showing the little spikes in the front, the more fanny part, or the more softer part in back. There's enough to do in drawing that without having to simultaneously think, how big should that mouth be? But fortunately, you've already got that other stuff figured out. Once I've got stuff on paper, I will then erase a few lines, crisp up others. I've got something to work with, so I'm going to refine these lines. Notice on some things like this fin here, I have not just added in some rays, but I've softened the edges of that, making it look a little bit more finny. Take a look at details up in here. So I've got something down, I'm erasing parts, I'm correcting those. And you go, okay, I basically like this fish that I've got. I could just leave it as a pencil line drawing like this. Or, if I like drawing with ink, I can ink it in. Or, in this case, I'm going to watercolor on top of it, because I think watercolor is fun. With watercolor, the general strategy is to start lighter and work darker. So I'm going to start with my lightest values and go darker. Very often, and you'll see that happens in this demonstration, partway through, you're getting into that darker place, and you realize, oh, I've got to add one more light thing in. And you have to kind of work it in around those dark parts because you don't want to smear and mess up those dark parts. It gets a little bit more difficult. It happens to everybody, but generally you'll see this flow. Starting lighter, working progressively darker. So I'm going to start just with the shadow on the bottom of the body here. And my favorite sort of if I'm going to have a generic sort of shadow approach, I'm going to take the paint Daniel Smith Shadow Violet and mix that with a little bit of the kind of the gray sludge that's on part of my palette and use that to make sort of my shadow tones in here. It starts to give a little bit of shape to the underside of this. In this part of the body, there's going to be sort of an iridescent shimmer. One way of kind of suggesting that is to put adjacent, very pale hues of pinks with some either purples or very often a very pale green works very nice, kind of adjacent with those pinks. Those sort of contrasting colors, that pink and that pale green, do a really good job of suggesting iridescence. So in the middle of my fish here, I'm just putting a few kind of blotches of pinks and some blues and those parts into that part of my drawing. And while that's drying, I'm then going to start working around the yellow parts on the edges of my fish. When that's dry, I can get even a darker orange and add details on top of that. So you can always, so this is starting lighter, going darker. Then I realized up in here with these pinks, I actually did want a few of those greens. I'm going to go back to adding something even lighter. And so I'm going to put some sort of green blotches in there. And right now it looks just a little bit too loud. Big blotches of pink and green in the middle of the white part of my fish. But you'll notice once there are darker things on top of this, that are much more strongly contrasting, your brain's not going to be jarred by these big patches of pink and green. They'll just sort of feel like a background sort of shimmer that's going on there. You'll see that in just a moment. Because what I'm about to do now is draw in some of the dark lines that make up the pattern on this fish. You can either freehand it or add in a few kind of guidelines to show you the directions that your lines are going to be going. And then I'm just painting directly on top of that. Here, with my brush is making a little kind of stuttering, jittery movement, and that blotch, 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 blotch makes this little broken pattern. And I just do that again and again, paying attention to the spacing of those as I wrap my way around the fish. That's all done on stuff that is dry underneath it, so that those dark lines don't go bleh. Color down again, and it stays put. Notice now that the greens and the magentas back there, they feel like just sort of a background shimmer rather than a real in-your-face blotches of pink and green. Because of the intense contrast of these, those drop back to something that you hardly notice. Add more areas of dark. And my darks are feeling pretty good. So here under this fin, I didn't draw the lines underneath this pectoral fin here. What I do, once I've got all this stuff out, is I get rid of most of the paint on my brush, mix it to a very weak version of the same thing, and continue those lines. And the fin looks transparent. So that's just the same color, just done lighter. So before, same color, just lighter under there, and you go like, oh wow, it's transparent. Then, on top of this business, I am going to add a little bit more dark. I had here to kind of work around these other lines. When I was doing this, I was like, I wish I did this before I put all those dark lines down. That's why this sort of strategy, dark to light. You can imagine kind of working around these sort of things so that you don't make a mess with that other stuff. It gets progressively difficult. But sometimes, you're here and you realize, oh, I should have done that. Just know I'm going to now have to work carefully around these things. If I can avoid that by pre-planning, that's great. It doesn't always happen. And then a really fun part, my white gel pen. So the gel pen is this white pen that you can draw on top of dark things. So look what you can do with it. Look up here in this part, in this black up here. I have the white coming up here and stopping. I now just take a few dots of white gel pen. Ooh, isn't that cool? Or here, a little bit of highlight. Here, there are rays that come out here, and those rays branch, and then branch and branch. So the biggest part of the rays are in close to the fish's tail there, and I can get a little suggestion of that there. Little highlight on top of the eye, mouth. And this I really liked. I liked this little highlight on the edge of that fin there. I think that worked. So my final step, if you look around the edges of this, it's kind of blurry edges. Very often I like to come around as the last step and just crisp up the edges. It's sort of a science illustration trick. They come around with a very sharp pencil. Here I'm using a 0.3 millimeter mechanical pencil just to come around and make the edges of this a little bit more defined. Take a look up here on the top. The other thing that I'm doing here is I am taking a very pale blue colored pencil and making a little bit of cross-hatching in this area here to suggest some of the scales on the fish. You see the same thing going on here. A little bit of cross-hatching. So here's before, after. That just gives you a little sense of scales on that. It's very, very fast. I'm not having to get in there and noodle in every scale, and I can move the ball down the field. I'm going to show you a step-by-step with a second fish, and what you're going to see is it's essentially the same thing going on, but with a few differences because of the different morphology of this next fish. This next one is a trout, right? And so it'll be a similar sort of thing going on with this trout, but let's sort of see what the differences are. And also, this one, remember that last one I kind of did towards the end? I was like, ooh, I wish I put these sort of pale things in, and I had to kind of get in there and kind of muck around. Sometimes the drawings work in nice, easy, clean steps. Sometimes you're partway through it and you kind of got to backtrack. In this one, especially in this area here, I made a mistake early on that I had to correct, and I'll sort of show you kind of how I went about doing that. This is the effect I wanted, this pink blaze showing up partway through the trout, this being a hint out in this area. And you'll see how I got into trouble early. This one's going to start off the same way. Very pale drawing. I often will use my erasable non-photo blue pencil. May I borrow yours? So not all non-photo blue pencils are created equally. This erasable one makes this super pale ghost image that you can barely see on your paper. Other non-photo blue pencils put down actually a big solid blotch of light blue. But this will be just light enough for you to be able to see it. And so you can make a ton of guidelines with this. And you don't have to even get in there and erase those. When you come later on in your picture, that's a good example right there with that. You'll find that this is it's a very useful pencil to start things off. You don't have to come back and do as much sort of erasing and correcting with it. So now I'm thinking, how wide is the body with this thing? At this point, I'm going to diverge from the path that I took on the previous fish. Because this is such a long fish, it's really easy for me to kind of get confused with its proportions, make the head too big. So what I'm going to do is say, for something that is this long and this wide, notice that this box is open-ended on this end. There's no hard stop right over here. I'm going to say, all right, this fish, its head, if it's this wide, its head is going to be about this much space. Its body is going to be roughly about this much space. And its tail is going to be out here. So I'm looking at the fish, and I am and putting down these basic guidelines. Again, proportions are the key at the start, not getting locked in those details. And this is a cooperative fish, because this is the sort of kind of measurement and drawing that is easy when the fish is dead or almost dead and sitting on the table in front of you. Next month, it's the fish swimming around in the aquarium, and we're kind of getting shots of kind of live fish. Here we are on the boat, and the person's just brought the dead fish in front of us. We get to draw our dead fish. All right. Inside this, I'm going to put the oval of my body. And then carve, using those negative shapes, into that once again. So these are the shapes that I'm looking at. And this one is much more symmetrical up front. So there I've got my sort of basic fish torpedo. Again, looking at those negative shapes. And then I'm going to do the same thing of starting to put in my fins. If I want to, I'll often make a little tick mark. Where does the fin start? Where does the fin end? And fit the fin in that. So where does it start? Where does it end? And then fit my fin in there. And I'll do that all over the entire fish. So it looks like this gets confusing with all of these little verticals in there. I'm exaggerating these. Notice in this sort of, you don't have to draw all those in, but it is useful at least to visualize these so that I see that this dorsal fin starts before the pelvic fin starts. And the pelvic fin ends before the dorsal fin comes down and ends. So I'm looking not just along the bottom edge, what is the space between here and here, I'm also looking at how these things relate to each other up and down on the fish as I'm going across. And if I've got this framework and take my time on this, I stop here. I expect there to be things goofy with my proportions. So I check, did I make the head too big? Oh, yes, I did. And before I kind of go on and add other things, here's another thing we here, so I can put my eye roughly this big. What is the different distance between the eye in the front and the eye in the back? How far down does my mouth go? Further on this one. And then I've got a framework to draw on my details. And that's where I'm going back to, look at those nice brachiostegial grooves right down there, that little operculum, those features which we're expecting to see on the face of the fish. I've got a chance. Do a double take on the shape and arc of your lateral line. Is it straight or does it have a little curve to it? So it will be different on different kinds of fish, and so that's a really good thing to look for.
His eye is totally above the midline, and the last one was totally below the midline.
Isn't that cool? Yeah. Yeah, that other one had its mouth like way down here too. This one's mouth is much more right up there on that midline. So you've got a general template, but that's going to be morphing around for different individual fish. So there's no generic fish. This is just, it's a very flexible kind of plastic model that we're going to be kind of getting the proportions of the different fish on top of. I'm going to paint this one as well. I start off with that same shadow. And then I'm going to add color on it. And I just got so excited about using my magenta, because you know me and magenta. I put my big magenta stripe down the middle, even though it wasn't there in this area, but I wasn't thinking. I was just like, I get to use my magenta. I was excited. Most fish that you're going to see have darker shading on top, lighter below. This is this interesting thing called counter shading, where the back of the fish is really dark. The belly is light, so that when there's shadow on the belly, it flattens what you see out. So if you're looking at that from a distance, a lot of fish with dark on the back, you're looking at them through the water column. It just looks like all one value going across, and it's hard to see that as a three-dimensional shape. Otherwise, you'd see, oh, there's a shadow on the bottom. It must be a three-dimensional thing. So it's another kind of cool way of, in open water, being camouflaged, having this pale belly, darker back. And you'll see as this drawing goes on, that back is going to get darker and darker. I'm going to build up the color of my fins with layers. More layers of color. Here, I wanted to put some pink into its cheek, but already had this stuff on. So like, oh no, I kind of got to work around those. So I'm going to put this pink in a very quick layer on top of dry paint. So if I don't have a big puddle of water and I'm not monkeying around there, I can often get in there and not really smudge my paint too much with a quick coat of paint. So more layers of color, more layers of color. And at this point, oh yeah, one more. At this point, I'm starting to realize that I shouldn't have this bright pink going all the way up here. And so what am I going to do about that? I am going to get my paper wet in this area and tap, 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 tap with a paper towel. And what that does is it lifts out some of this pink. You can't do that on all paper. You can't do that with all pigments, so you actually just have to experiment with the stuff that you have. Some colors like phthalo blue, once it's there, it's locked into the paper. You're not going to be able to get that out. But this I can lift this quinacridone magenta out a little bit. And so I wet this area, tap, 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 and I can start to pull it out. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention that I'm also doing here is notice that I have put in the dark of the eye here. The reason that I'm doing this at this point is that what happens to me a lot with my drawings when I'm doing this kind of working from light to dark is I get all the values kind of relative to each other to be kind of, looking pretty fishy. But the whole drawing overall is way too pale. So my darkest point is this medium shade of gray. I now will often find myself early in my drawing dropping in what I call an anchor, a dark anchor. Some little point that is saying, here's the real dark value that I'm moving towards. And I can put that in. And then what I'll do is, as I'm putting in the other darks on this fish, that's the point that I'm moving towards. That helps me kind of get a better value range in my drawing. So anyway, back to blotting the stuff out. So blot, 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 blot. It gets lighter there, and I can then take some of the greenish brown and pull that into that area and cover up some of that mistake. Often before putting paint onto the page, I will mix it up on my palette off on the side and then test it, not on my drawing. I'll test it off on another piece of paper or on the sidebar of my paper. And what that allows me to do is have you ever put paint on your drawing, you're going like, ooh, I didn't think it was going to be that color, or much too strong, or it's this too much of a watery yuck? I figure that out on the side. And then when I go in here and I'm drawing on my fish, it's not as strong. So on this little fish here, I realized that I wanted a few very pale blue spots called par marks down the side of the body. Tested this off on the side so that when I came in here, it would just be ghosty enough. Testing on the side is great before you hit here. I let this dry, and I can now start to put spots on the fish. Notice how nicely dark spots go on top of lighter things. If I did these first, I would have a real problem of something to work around. And here's the secret for drawing spots on things. What we tend to do is we kind of go like, oh, and then there are spots on the fish. And so what you start to do is you get your brush and you start going blot, 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 blot. I'm putting in my spot, 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 spot. And you kind of get hypnotized by the. So what this turns out, you get these sort of weird patterns that kind of are the result of you just sort of sitting there kind of going blah, 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 blah. A better approach is not to think about having to do this whole thing at once. If you do it at once, it really sucks you into the blah, 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 because you've got all this real estate to cover. Just say to yourself, I'm going to do this section right here. And place each dot. Place the dot, place the dot, place the dot, place the dot. Look back at the subject. What is the size of my dots? What's the spacing between them? Place the dot, place the dot. I don't need to dot for dot copy it over. If I want to get the rough distance and the size between these things, and thinking of placing each dot, if I'm just doing a small area, my brain will let me do that. And then I do the next area over, and then the next area over, instead of doing the entire thing at once. So one little area at a time, you're placing your dots, then you get sort of the change in sizes of things. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll do like this part over here, I'll do this part over here. And then I can do some part in the middle, and then I can morph that into that, and then that into that. And it gets you kind of looking back at the fish as you're putting those dots in. Dots on my fins. And those actually made really neat patterns because I was placing them. I go like, oh, there are little lines of spots in there. If you're kind of just getting into the dot, 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 oh, there are dots out on the tail, there's dots out on the fin. But you really want to look at the dots. Is there a pattern here? And you're placing those dots. That makes a big difference. Then I got out my white gel pen. I just made a little X patterns. I'll talk more about scale patterns in a second. But what these are X patterns and a few little dots along the lateral line there. And that does a pretty good job of suggesting scaliness. I then came along, again, remember that step at the end of the last one where I kind of crisped up the edges? Look at these sort of soft, fuzzy edges on this. A little bit more of a crisper edge, and that really pops that drawing. That's a scientific illustration convention. So you don't have to do that, but there sort of is a neat kind of a graphic effect with that. It does make it look a little bit more sort of postery and cartoony. This softer edge might sort of actually feel a little bit more natural. It's a convention in scientific illustration, so I did it here. You get to choose whether or not you want to do that. If I want this fish to feel like a real swimmy fish out there in the water, I would probably leave it just like this. You'll look at a lot of fish drawings, and this one doesn't really look that sort of wet and glistening. And what people will do is they will put highlights on their fish. And now it looks wet. There's all this sort of light sparkling on it. Maybe I kind of went, you can tend to overdo it. I did overdo it here, right? A little bit, good. Too much, not a good idea. But also, think about it. These sort of bright highlights on something, that's what I'm going to see on the fish that has been brought out of the water and is now in the air. Its surface is wet and glistening, and there's sunlight bouncing off of it. In the water, everything's wet, right? And so this sort of change in the reflectiveness on something because it's wet doesn't happen. And so this is a drawing now of a fish out of water, right? But we're so sort of used to like, oh, got to make it look wet and slimy. But even when people are drawing fish in the water, they will make it look wet, right? By putting these fish out of water highlights on it. So decide what you want to do. You're going to do. So if you like, look at my field guide to the Sierra Nevada. Like, there's like a ton of really bright highlights on a bunch of these fish, and so those are, well, maybe you've caught the fish and it's now out of, what type of fish is this, right? That's really different than that fish that's down there in the water. So you decide, are you going to be drawing a fish in the water or out of the water? And if you are drawing a fish out of water, well then, like, go to town on your highlights, but stop earlier than I did, and you'll be happy. Also, people always do this little highlight in the eye, to make it look wet and alive, but the whole thing is wet, and when it's underneath the water, that little sort of wet, not wet shine thing, it's not going on there. So some fish have metallic reflective scales, and you see a lot of reflection on those sort of things. But most other fish, the body actually looks a little bit more dull and matte underneath the water. Then we get it out and we see, oh, I'm going to put all my little glossy bits on. So show restraint on that. Last thing I want to talk about is scale. Right? And the big scale trick is these X's. I get some lines going this way and some lines going this way, and where those meet, I make little X's. X, 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 X. And inside each one of those is one of my snake scales or fish scales. If I take so here is my X's, and those are my little scales, right? So I'll draw with my, or I could just draw with my white pencil a set of lines this way and a set of lines this way, or my white gel pen, and I've got a little sense of scales. If I take a closer look at it, what you'll see is that rather than an X, this is actually a little subtle S. See that? And this is a little subtle S down there. So it kind of S's out. The angle of that line, there's an inflection in it as it gets to the edge of my object. So if I'm going back, here's a carp. If I take a closer look at the scales in here, look at this. See that curve? Little S. And then let's see what that does. It comes down and curves the other way. And here, this row is curved up and then straight. I wonder what it's going to, yep, it starts to go off that way. So you have these slight little S curves. On a big scaled fish like this carp, whoop, look for that. So I start looking for this more, and I can go like, oh. Yeah, I can See a little kind of change in that angle there. That will help me get that.
The negative color, the darker color in there is.
Oh, isn't that interesting? So, and notice that those are forming straight lines across, right? So she's saying that those dark patterns here on each scale, what I end up with here is because of these X's, I get rows of scales that are aligned this way. And each one of those has a little dark mark on it. When I'm looking at this from a distance, what may actually be more prominent is these little dark rows of dots this way. If I get too into kind of drawing these X's across it, I may lose the impact of that. So sometimes what I'll do is just on part of a fish, have some of this X pattern drawn and shown. And people will see that and they'll go like, their brain will go, oh, it scales across the entire fish. So rather than putting scale, 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 scale across the entire thing, just a little bit can go a long way. Also, on some fish, the scales are much smaller. So here, if I start trying to do this stuff, I'm going to be like, what can I? So instead, take a look at this. I zoom it up, I can see that kind of S going on. But notice in the opposite direction, I'm really not seeing a pattern. And look here, I can see clear lines coming up this way. I go the opposite direction, I'm really not, it's hard for me to make out patterns. Here I've got clear lines, little avenues, rows of dots. But I'm not seeing that coming up the other way, all the way to the other end. And look at that nice line of highlight right along the lateral line. Follow that here. So that gives you a few ideas about how to play with the scales, how to mess with the proportions of a fish. A strategy, if you're working with watercolor, of starting light, building towards darker colors. But I'd say the big take-home is to mess with those proportions at the start, have an understanding of some of the fish anatomy, and there are details and structures that you'll be able to see that somebody who's just kind of coming at it and going, I guess this is a fish, I guess I'll draw it, without any kind of fish and anatomical background, they're going to miss. You will often see people leave fins out entirely in drawings. But once you kind of have this on your radar, that there are these different sort of types of fins, I'm going to expect one pair here, and then another pair down here, then in the middle, a single one. That framework really helps you be able to look at something and see what you are observing and get that down onto the paper. To help you do this, you've got homework. So here's your homework assignment. 3 fish. 3 fish. And these can be done either by going online and finding photos of fish and putting those either one drawing or a composite of several things and putting them together and building up a fish drawing. Tropical fish are crazy fun to do. Check out different species of butterfly fish, and you can get into all sorts of outrageous patterns. If you want, you can do dory. Another really fun way to do it is to go to a fish market and get yourself a real fish. Right? You go to a fish market, get a fish, and you go to some of these ones where they got a ton of fish on ice. You can get a fairly fresh fish, and you can see all these little interesting features. And you can open and close its little fish mouth, and so not prepared fillets. The fillets, that doesn't really help us. All right? But you get the whole fish, and you can play with its little fish mouth, and look at its little fish eyes, and take the fins, put them up and down, and sort of see how much sort of motion you get in it, and see if you can find its lateral line, and draw from that real fish. Then you can go online and find color photographs of that same species to kind of color correct your drawing. Oh wait, hold on. We got to get from the back. I'm going to ask Uncle Ashok to come on down because I just saw the best fish imitation. Please do. Come on down. Come on. Oh, your thing's on. We had a special request for Ashok to film this, and this guy. All right, and notice he drove here in a cast for you, friends at home. So want to send a mad shout out to Uncle Ashok, and which is what my kids call him. So with a busted arm, came down from Mendocino today, especially to film this for you. So again, I want to thank you for doing that, and an excellent fish imitation. Go to a fish market, get a real fish, try that, or just fish from online pictures. Mess with several different fish. See if you can find ones with different fin types, different densities of scales, and play with this stuff. And you'll get familiar with kind of the face of a fish, and how to make your fish face look fishy. Next month, we're going to be taking this sort of structure of fish that you now get and start to kind of turn it around in three-dimensional space, drawing all the kind of action poses we'll then be seeing when we're sketching at the Academy of Sciences, and or any aquarium that you want to go to. And so that'll be a lot of fun. But it really helps to spend some quality time just kind of wrapping your head around these fins and fish bits. And that way you won't just be floundering around when we get to those 3D fish. Thank you very much for coming. If you enjoyed this workshop, a couple of things. Online, you'll be able to find a bunch of videos that Ashok has made. If you go to the johnmuirlaws.com, I'm now uploading all the ones that I can find that we've filmed in the past. If this workshop has been helpful to you, you might be interested in picking up this book on nature journaling, nature drawing and journaling. The only problem is there's no fish in here. No fish in here. So this whole fish thing I worked out after the book came out, so there's no fish in here. But there are a lot of other very useful journaling ideas. Also, this just came out. It is a blank journal that is partially white pages, partially toned paper pages, with a page holder band. And at the back, there are several kind of reference sheets, the Beaufort wind scale, sort of guides to sort of density of cover, estimating numbers, and some kind of high percentage pages of sort of things that I think are like the top tips on drawing. And also a place to put in your own table of contents. So you write your own page numbers back here. And then if you're, for instance, have something you've been out sketching and it took 4 pages, you draw a box around those 4 pages and write some little caption of what was happening in there. So you can just take a quick look at the back of your book. And you've got your table of contents. The cover piece comes off so that you can decorate and paint and draw on the cover of your own journal to personalize it. So if you're interested in picking those up, I've got them for sale over there. You can also buy them off of my website. And if you didn't bring money, it's just on the honor system. So next time you see me, you can either pay me then, or if you can't afford it now and you really like it, take whatever you want. And if at some point in the future you can pay me back, please do. If not, you have to find another way of paying it forward. Also, these workshops are sponsored by your donations. Any donation that you put in right now or make online is matched dollar for dollar by the Dean Witter Foundation. They gave me a challenge grant to try to raise $20,000, and they will match every dollar that goes into that. And so if you're considering donating, now is a great time to do that. But thank you folks for coming. I hope that this was useful to you, and I hope to see you at our next field trip. Why am I blanking on the name? The gardens at Heather Farms. Heather Farms over in Walnut Creek. So if you haven't been there, really neat. It is developed gardens, but it is There are a bunch of really kind of beautiful areas. It's one of the most interesting free public gardens that I know of in the Bay Area, and I think you'll enjoy exploring there as a naturalist. Thank you for coming. I hope you had fun.